She sent an urgent work email to the wrong person. One letter difference in the first name. 5 minutes later, the Mafia boss replied, "I'm coming. You shouldn't be alone." She tried to cancel. He said he was already on his way. And that's how a typo turned into the most dangerous romance of her life. This is the story of how one accidental email led to everything. Marie Almond had exactly 38 minutes before her conference call with a client who was already unhappy, and she was spending 20 of them trying not to panic. Not because the project was impossible, though this rebrand was admittedly complex, but because she'd been working alone on crisis communications for 16 hours straight and was starting to feel the walls of her apartment close in. She'd moved to New York 3 years ago for exactly this kind of high-stakes work. Sterling Communications, her own consulting firm, her own clients, her own schedule that somehow meant she never stopped working and rarely saw another human being outside of Zoom calls and coffee shop lines. Her phone buzzed. Another email from the client. Another round of notes. Another reminder that she was drowning and had no one to talk to about it. She opened a new email and typed quickly, her fingers moving faster than her exhausted brain. She needed Dennis, her colleague Dennis Walters, who'd worked crisis communications for 10 years and always knew how to talk her down from the ledge when projects got messy. They'd met at a conference 2 years ago, stayed in touch, and he'd become her unofficial sounding board for exactly these moments. She pulled up her contacts and typed Dennis into the search bar. 2 results appeared: Dennis Waldron, Dennis Walters. She clicked the first one without checking the last name because her eyes were blurry from screen time and her brain was already composing the message. And she typed the email in under 2 minutes, her frustration pouring out faster than her professional filter could catch it. Subject: Need your brain on this. Dennis, I'm drowning in this project and could really use support right now. Client is impossible, timeline is brutal, and I'm completely alone in this mess. Are you available to talk tonight? Even just 20 minutes. I need someone who gets it. Let me know. Marie. She hit send at 9:47 p.m., closed her laptop with more force than necessary, and walked to her kitchen to make tea she probably wouldn't drink. Her phone stayed face down on the counter while she stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline and wondered, not for the first time, why success felt so isolating. Meanwhile, across the city, in a corner office on the 42nd floor of Waldron Tower in Midtown, Dennis Waldron was reviewing territory agreements that should have been finalized 3 weeks ago when his phone lit up with a new email notification. He glanced at the sender name. Marie Almond. Sterling Communications. Marie. He stopped reading the contract in front of him entirely. Marie Almond. 6 months ago, she'd spent 2 weeks consulting at Waldron Properties on corporate messaging strategy for a new development launch. Professional, polished, brilliant at her work. And so careful with her words that he'd known immediately she was performing, presenting the version of herself that got respect and closed deals, never the version that was tired or uncertain or struggling. He'd noticed her the first day, noticed the way she commanded the conference room with quiet confidence, noticed the way she listened more than she spoke, but always had the smartest observation when she did. Noticed the way she left the building alone every evening with her laptop bag and a posture that suggested she carried more weight than anyone saw. He'd wanted to ask for her contact information, wanted to suggest coffee that wasn't about contracts and branding strategies, wanted to know if the careful composure ever cracked and what she looked like when it did. But he couldn't. Not then. Because Veronica Chase had been texting him 15 times a day, creating public scenes at events, performing a relationship for social media that he'd been trying to end for months, because approaching Marie while still entangled with Veronica would have been disrespectful to both of them. Because the timing was wrong. So he'd let Marie Almond walk out of his building after 2 weeks, stored her name in his memory, and told himself that if an opportunity ever presented itself, he wouldn't miss it twice. He opened the email, read it once, then again, then a third time. I'm drowning in this project and could really use support right now. I'm completely alone in this mess. I need someone who gets it. Dennis read the sign-off. Marie, not the formal Marie Almond, sterling communication signature she'd used in every professional email 6 months ago. Just Marie. Vulnerable, reaching out. Alone. He knew immediately this email wasn't meant for him. The tone was too familiar, too unguarded. She was reaching out to someone she trusted, someone she'd let see past the professional performance. But she'd sent it to him instead. And Dennis Waldron had spent 6 months waiting for a reason to contact Marie Almond. Had spent 2 weeks during her consultation watching her maintain perfect composure while clearly carrying invisible weight. Had spent months after extracting himself from Veronica's chaos and thinking about the woman who'd commanded his conference room with intelligence and carefully hidden exhaustion. This email, this mistake, this moment of her vulnerability landing directly in his inbox felt like the universe handing him exactly what he'd been waiting for. He checked the time. 9:52 p.m. 5 minutes since she'd sent it. He typed his response in under 30 seconds, his decision already made. Subject. Need your brain on this. Marie, I'm coming. Tonight, 7 p.m. tomorrow evening. I'll bring dinner. You shouldn't be alone in this. What's your address? DW. He hit send before he could second-guess the decision, before the rational part of his brain could list all the reasons this was inappropriate or forward, or potentially unwelcome. She'd said she was drowning. She'd said she was alone. She'd reached out for support. And Dennis Waldron had built an empire on reading moments and acting decisively. This was his moment. And he wasn't missing it twice. Across the city, Marie's phone lit up on her kitchen counter. She glanced at it, expecting Dennis Walters confirming he could talk. Instead, she saw a name that made her stomach drop. Dennis Waldron. Her teacup froze halfway to her mouth. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and opened the email, her mind racing through every possible explanation before landing on the only one that made horrible, mortifying sense. She'd sent her desperate, vulnerable, completely unprofessional crisis email to Dennis Waldron, the developer, the client, the man with a reputation that made seasoned executives nervous, the man she'd consulted for 6 months ago and had maintained perfect professional boundaries with because he was powerful and dangerous and absolutely not someone you showed weakness to. And he'd responded, "I'm coming. You shouldn't be alone in this." Marie read the email 3 times, her professional panic warring with something else she couldn't quite name. Horror, confusion, and underneath it all, something that felt dangerously close to relief. Because Dennis Waldron had read her moment of complete vulnerability, and his response wasn't judgment or dismissal. It was protection. And Marie Almond, who'd spent 3 years building a successful consulting firm while slowly disappearing into isolation, had no idea what to do with that. This narrative flow establishes immediate tension through the mistake, builds emotional stakes through Marie's isolation and exhaustion, creates curiosity through Dennis's perspective and his 6-month wait, and transitions into the introduction with the shocking realization and his protective response, setting up everything that follows. Will Marie navigate Dennis's dangerous world without losing herself? How will their love survive when his past comes back with consequences? What happens when the protection he promised is tested by threats neither of them saw coming? Subscribe now to continue their journey, because some stories are too powerful to experience alone, and this one has only just begun. Don't let this be the end. Subscribe and discover what comes next for Marie and Dennis, where love meets danger and every choice matters. Marie's fingers moved across the keyboard with the kind of desperation that came from 16 hours of crisis management and no end in sight. The rebrand proposal glowed accusingly on her screen, while her client's latest round of impossible notes sat unread in her inbox. 3 years in New York, and this was what success looked like. Her apartment at midnight, takeout containers forming archaeological layers by her desk, and the kind of exhaustion that made her eyes burn when she blinked. She needed Dennis, her colleague Dennis Walters, who talked her through worse project spirals than this and always knew exactly what to say. Her mouse hovered over her contacts, found Dennis W. at the top of the search results, and she clicked without checking the last name because her brain was already composing the message. Dennis, I'm drowning in this project and could really use support right now. Are you available to talk tonight? I'm completely alone in this mess and need someone who gets it. Let me know. Marie. She hit send at 9:47 p.m. and immediately returned to her proposal, already half forgetting the email in the fog of deadline panic. Across the city in a corner office on the 42nd floor of Waldron Tower, Dennis Waldron was reviewing territory agreements that should have been finalized weeks ago when his phone lit up with a notification that made him forget the contracts entirely. Marie Almond. He remembered her immediately. 6 months ago, she'd spent 2 weeks consulting at Waldron Properties on corporate messaging strategy. Professional, polished, brilliant at her work. He'd noticed the way she commanded conference rooms with quiet confidence, the way she left the building alone every evening with a posture that suggested she carried more weight than anyone saw. He'd wanted to ask for her contact information then. Wanted to suggest coffee that wasn't about contracts and branding strategies, but Veronica had still been creating public scenes, performing a relationship for social media that he'd been trying to end for months. The timing had been wrong, so he'd let Marie Almond walk out of his building after 2 weeks and told himself that if an opportunity ever presented itself, he wouldn't miss it twice. He opened the email, read it once, then again, then a third time. I'm drowning in this project and could really use support right now. I'm completely alone in this mess. I need someone who gets it. Dennis knew immediately this email wasn't meant for him. The tone was too familiar, too unguarded. She was reaching out to someone she trusted, someone she'd let see past the professional performance, but she'd sent it to him instead. And Dennis Waldron had spent 6 months waiting for exactly this, a reason to contact Marie Almond that didn't feel like overstepping. He checked the time. 9:52 p.m. 5 minutes since she'd sent it. His response took 30 seconds to type, his decision already made. Marie, I'm coming. Tonight, 7:00 p.m. tomorrow evening. I'll bring dinner. You shouldn't be alone in this. What's your address? DW. He hit send before the rational part of his brain could list all the reasons this might be inappropriate, or forward, or potentially unwelcome. She'd said she was drowning. She'd said she was alone. She'd reached out for support. And Dennis Waldron had built an empire on reading moments and acting decisively. This was his moment, and he wasn't missing it twice. Marie's phone lit up on her kitchen counter while she stared out at the Manhattan skyline, her tea forgotten in her hand. She glanced down, expecting Dennis Walters confirming he could talk. Instead, she saw 2 letters that made her stomach drop. DW. Her teacup froze halfway to her mouth. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and opened the email, her mind racing through every possible explanation before landing on the only one that made horrible, mortifying sense. Dennis Waldron. Not Dennis Walters. Dennis Waldron. The developer. The client. The man with a reputation that made seasoned executives nervous. The man she'd consulted for 6 months ago and had maintained perfect professional boundaries with because he was powerful and dangerous and absolutely not someone you showed weakness to. She'd sent her desperate, vulnerable, completely unprofessional crisis email to Dennis Waldron, and he'd responded, I'm coming. You shouldn't be alone in this. Marie read the email 3 times. her professional panic overwhelming everything else. This was a disaster. This was career-ending mortification. This was exactly the kind of mistake that turned respected consultants into cautionary tales about maintaining professional boundaries. Her fingers flew across her phone screen, typing an apology with the kind of formal precision that came from 3 years of damage control. Mr. Waldron, I am so sorry. That email was meant for a colleague. Please disregard it entirely. My sincere apologies for the confusion. Marie Almond, Sterling Communications. She hit send and immediately opened her laptop to double-check her contacts, confirming what she already knew. 2 Dennis contacts. Dennis Waldron. Dennis Walters. She'd clicked the first one without checking the last name because her eyes were blurry and her brain was exhausted, and now she was living every professional's nightmare. Her phone buzzed. Already, less than a minute after she'd sent the apology. Marie, I know it was a mistake. I'm still coming. You said you needed support. I'm already on my way. 7 p.m. Don't argue. DW. She stared at the email, her mind unable to process the words in any configuration that made sense. He knew it was a mistake. He was still coming. He was already on his way. She called Jessica before she could talk herself out of it, her hands still shaking. Jessica answered on the second ring. Marie, what's wrong? I sent a crisis email to the wrong person. Marie's voice came out higher than normal, edged with panic. I meant to email Dennis Walters. I emailed Dennis Waldron instead. The developer? Jessica's tone shifted immediately to full attention. What did you say? That I was drowning in a project and completely alone and needed someone who gets it. Marie closed her eyes, mortification burning through her chest. I sent it to a client, Jessica. A powerful client with connections to people who make other people disappear. What did he say? Marie read both emails aloud, her voice cracking slightly on the last line. He said he's already on his way and I shouldn't argue. Silence on the other end. Then Jessica's voice came back different, softer, almost awed. Marie, that's the most protective thing I've ever read. He's a client. Marie pressed her palm against her forehead. This is inappropriate. This is... He remembered you. Jessica cut her off gently. 6 months later, he remembered you immediately. He's dropping everything. He read your vulnerability and his response wasn't judgment or dismissal. It was protection. Marie's breath caught. Let him come, Jessica said quietly. You said you were alone. You don't have to be. At exactly 7 p.m., Marie's buzzer sounded with the kind of precision that suggested Dennis Waldron didn't do anything approximately. She'd spent the last hour oscillating between changing clothes 3 times and wondering if she could pretend she wasn't home. The casual silk blouse and tailored pants she'd settled on felt simultaneously too formal and not formal enough for whatever this situation was. She buzzed him up and opened her door to find Dennis Waldron holding bags from Carbone with the same commanding presence that had made her conference room feel smaller 6 months ago. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit he'd somehow made look casual by losing the tie, with an intensity in his dark eyes that suggested he was used to reading situations other people missed. He stepped into her apartment like he'd been invited rather than having shown up uninvited to a professional disaster, setting the bags on her kitchen counter with easy confidence. Marie, he said, and something about the way he used her first name made her realize she'd been holding her breath. I know you meant that email for someone else. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but he continued before she could speak. But I'm glad you sent it to me. He turned to face her fully, his expression direct in a way that made her forget about the carefully practiced professional distance she'd maintained 6 months ago. I noticed you when you consulted at my building. I wanted to ask for your contact information then, but the timing was wrong. Marie's carefully constructed response disappeared entirely. You noticed me? Dennis pulled containers from the bags, his movements deliberate as though giving her time to process. I was publicly involved with Veronica Chase. You probably saw the social media posts, the event photos. It looked like a relationship. It was actually 6 months of trying to extract myself from something toxic and performative. He met her eyes again, and Marie saw something underneath the commanding presence, honesty that felt almost vulnerable. I couldn't approach you then. It would have been disrespectful to both of you. But I remembered you. The way you commanded that conference room. The way you left every evening alone looking like you carried weight no one else saw. Marie's heart was doing something complicated in her chest that felt dangerous and compelling in equal measure. When I saw your email tonight, Dennis continued quietly, I saw it as timing finally being right. I wasn't going to miss the chance again. The apartment felt smaller with him in it, the air charged with something Marie couldn't quite name. She should send him away. This was inappropriate. This was a professional boundary she'd spent 3 years carefully maintaining. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Why do you care about a stranger's work crisis?" Dennis paused in opening the containers, his expression shifting to something that looked almost surprised she'd asked. "Because you're not a stranger to me," he said simply. "I remembered you for 6 months. That's not nothing." He set down the container and stepped closer. Though he maintained careful distance, and because no one should be alone when they're drowning. The words hit Marie sideways, the same protective instinct from his email, now spoken aloud in her apartment with an intensity that made her realize Jessica had been right. This wasn't a client showing up out of obligation. This was a man who'd been waiting 6 months for an opportunity and wasn't going to waste it. Marie looked at Dennis Waldron standing in her kitchen with expensive Italian food and careful honesty, and felt the careful isolation she'd built around herself crack just slightly. "Okay," she said quietly. "Stay." They ate at her small kitchen table with the Manhattan skyline glittering through the window, and Marie discovered that Dennis Waldron asked questions like someone who actually wanted answers. Not networking questions or professional small talk, but real questions about her work, her frustrations, why she'd moved to New York 3 years ago, and whether it had turned out the way she'd hoped. She found herself being honest in ways she rarely was, even with Jessica. Admitting she was lonely, admitting she was exhausted from always performing competence, admitting that success looked nothing like she'd imagined when she'd left Chicago with a business plan and enough ambition to fill her empty apartment twice over. Dennis listened with the kind of attention that made her feel like her words mattered, like her admissions weren't weaknesses, but simply truths he wanted to understand. Then his expression shifted, becoming serious in a way that made the air in her apartment change. "Marie, I need to tell you something before this goes further." He set down his fork with careful deliberation. "My real estate business is legitimate. The developments, the properties, the public face of Waldron Properties, all legal, all documented, all clean." He paused, holding her gaze. "But my family is involved in operations that exist outside the law. Territory control, enforcement, strategic power plays. I won't insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise or dressing it up with euphemisms." Marie's heart rate picked up, but not with the panic she expected. Instead, she felt oddly calm, like a piece of a puzzle she'd been circling around had finally clicked into place. The reputation that made executives nervous, the intensity that suggested he was used to reading threats other people missed. The careful control that felt less like corporate polish and more like disciplined power. She processed this information with the same analytical mind that had built her consulting firm, running through implications and consequences and the fact that Dennis Waldron had just trusted her with something that could destroy him. Then she asked the only question that actually mattered. "Do you hurt people who don't deserve it?" Dennis's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested the question had surprised him. "No," His answer came without hesitation. I have codes. Lines I don't cross. People under my protection stay protected. People who violate agreements or threaten what's mine face consequences. But I don't hurt innocents. Ever. Marie nodded slowly, her mind turning over his words and finding them somehow less concerning than they should be. Then I'm less concerned about what you do, she said quietly, than whether you're going to hurt me. The look Dennis gave her held something that felt dangerously close to reverence. I will protect you from everything, including myself if necessary. He leaned forward slightly, his intensity focused entirely on her. But I won't lie to you. Ever. That's my promise. You'll always know exactly where you stand with me, even when the truth is complicated. Marie looked at this man sitting in her kitchen. Powerful, dangerous, honest in ways that made her carefully constructed professional persona feel like performance art. He'd remembered her for 6 months. He'd dropped everything when she'd accidentally reached out. He'd just trusted her with information that could end him. And this conversation, with all its dangerous honesty and complicated truths, was the realest thing she'd experienced in 3 years of New York success and carefully maintained isolation. She made her decision. I want to see where this leads, she said. Dennis's expression shifted into something that looked like relief and determination combined. Then we start now. Tonight. No more performing. Just truth. Dennis's text arrived at 8:47 a.m. while Marie was staring at her laptop and pretending yesterday evening hadn't fundamentally altered something in her carefully controlled life. Tonight. Let me take you somewhere. 7:05 p.m. She should say no. She should establish boundaries and maintain professional distance, and remember that this man had just told her his family operated outside the law. Instead, she typed yes before her rational brain could intervene. He picked her up in a black car that felt more like transportation for someone who needed security than simple luxury, and took her to a private rooftop garden in Brooklyn she didn't know existed. String lights created constellations overhead while the city sprawled below them, and a catered dinner waited at a table positioned to make the skyline feel like it belonged to them alone. This is beautiful, Marie said, and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with the setting. Dennis pulled out her chair with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that felt natural rather than performed. I wanted somewhere we could talk without interruption. They ate slowly, the conversation flowing with the same easy intensity from the night before, and then Dennis set down his glass and looked at her with an expression that suggested he was about to ask something that mattered. Tell me something you've never told anyone. Marie's breath caught. The question was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical contact, and everything to do with trust she hadn't earned yet, but found herself wanting to give anyway. Moving to New York was supposed to make me feel successful. She looked down at her hands, then forced herself to meet his eyes. Instead, I feel invisible and replaceable. Like I built everything I wanted and somehow ended up lonelier than I started. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and raw. And Dennis's expression shifted into something that looked like he understood exactly what she meant. I never wanted to take over my family's operations, he said quietly. I was 26. I had plans that didn't involve territory agreements and enforcement protocols. Then my father had a heart attack during a meeting, and suddenly I had no choice. I inherited an empire I didn't ask for, and responsibilities I wasn't ready to carry. Marie felt something crack open in her chest. You were just a kid. Old enough to have no excuse for failing. Dennis's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. So I learned fast, built codes and systems and control, and told myself that choosing to do it well was the same as choosing to do it. They talked for hours after that, the conversation moving between heavy truths and lighter moments with a rhythm that felt effortless. Marie realized she was falling for someone she barely knew, but who somehow saw her completely. Not the professional performance or the careful composure, but the exhausted, lonely, ambitious woman underneath who'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly visible. When Dennis took her home, he walked her to her door with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. Then he paused, his hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his reputation. "Marie," he said, and then he kissed her. It was both gentle and consuming, a kiss that confirmed what they both already knew. This wasn't casual, this wasn't simple, and this was already too far gone to walk away from. When he pulled back, his thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating softness. "Tomorrow?" he asked. Marie nodded, unable to form words around the feeling expanding in her chest. "Tomorrow," she managed. Within 2 weeks, they were inseparable in a way that defied Marie's careful approach to relationships and Dennis's reputation for control. He made time in a schedule that ran billion-dollar operations. She rearranged client calls and deadlines to see him. They had dinner 4 nights in a row, then 5. Then Marie stopped counting because the pattern had become her new normal. 3 weeks after the accidental email that had started everything, Marie stayed at Dennis's penthouse for the first time. The space was exactly what she'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, expensive minimalism, the kind of luxury that announced power without needing to explain itself. What she hadn't expected was how completely he unraveled her. Their physical connection was as intense as their emotional one, consuming and honest and overwhelming in ways that left Marie breathless and certain she'd never experienced anything close to this before. Afterward, Dennis held her against his chest with a tenderness that contradicted everything about his public persona, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder like he was memorizing her. "I don't do this," he said quietly into the darkness. "I don't make time like this. I don't rearrange operations and delay meetings and cancel obligations." Marie's breath caught, waiting for whatever came next. "But you're worth rearranging everything for." He pressed a kiss to her temple, the gesture devastatingly gentle. "You've been worth it since the moment I read that email and realized timing had finally given me a chance." Marie turned in his arms to look at him, seeing something in his expression that looked almost vulnerable beneath the controlled intensity. "I'm falling for you," she admitted, because honesty seemed to be the only language they spoke with each other. Dennis's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I fell 3 weeks ago when you asked if I was going to hurt you, and decided my answer was enough." 2 nights later, Marie attended a corporate event for a client, the kind of networking function she usually navigated with practiced professionalism. She was standing by the bar when a man in an expensive suit approached with the kind of confidence that suggested he wasn't used to being told no. "You're Marie Almond, Sterling Communications." His smile was practiced, his attention just slightly too focused. "I've been hoping to get you alone. I have a proposition that might interest you." Before Marie could respond with her standard polite deflection, Dennis appeared beside her with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been watching from across the room. "She's with me," Dennis said calmly, his hand settling at the small of Marie's back with possessive certainty. The man's expression changed instantly. Recognition, then calculation, then retreat, happening so fast Marie almost missed the progression. "Waldron. My apologies. I didn't realize." The man backed away with the kind of deference that spoke to reputation and power Marie was only beginning to understand. Dennis watched him leave, then turned his attention to Marie with an intensity that made the crowded room disappear. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Marie nodded, processing what had just happened. The man had recognized Dennis's name and left immediately, not because of social courtesy, but because Dennis Waldron claiming someone meant that person was protected, untouchable, under the kind of protection that came with consequences. She should be concerned. She should be questioning what she'd gotten herself into. Instead, she leaned slightly into Dennis's hand at her back and felt safer than she'd felt in 3 years of carefully controlled independence. Marie was leaving Dennis's building at 7:30 a.m. on a Thursday, still wearing yesterday's clothes and carrying her laptop bag, when she encountered Veronica Chase in the lobby. Marie recognized her immediately from the social media photos Dennis had mentioned, beautiful in the kind of deliberate way that required effort and maintenance, dressed in designer everything, with an expression that suggested she knew exactly who Marie was. Marie Almond. Veronica's voice was smooth, practiced, cold. I wanted to meet the woman Dennis has been rearranging his life for. Marie stopped, her professional instincts telling her to be polite, while every other instinct warned her this conversation was a trap. You think you know him? Veronica stepped closer, her smile sharp enough to cut. You don't. He'll get distant, shut you out, make you feel like you're not enough. That's what he does. He's good at the beginning, the intensity, the attention, making you feel like you're the only person in his world. Then it changes. She tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. I'm just preparing you, saving you the confusion when it happens. Marie held Veronica's gaze, her heart rate elevated but her voice steady. Thank you for the warning. She walked away before Veronica could say anything else, her hands shaking slightly as she stepped outside into the morning air. That evening, she told Dennis about the encounter. His expression went cold in a way that made Marie understand exactly why people backed away when he entered rooms. I'm furious, he said quietly, the controlled anger more intimidating than shouting would have been. Not at you. At her, for trying to sabotage what we're building with her own failed experience. He moved closer, his hands framing Marie's face with the gentle intensity she'd come to recognize as his way of making sure she heard him completely. I pushed Veronica away because I didn't want her. Every day she stayed felt like suffocation. He held Marie's gaze with absolute certainty. I want you closer every single day. That's the difference. I promise you'll always know where you stand with me. When I'm struggling, I'll tell you. When work gets complicated, I'll tell you. You won't have to guess or feel uncertain or wonder if you're enough. Marie felt the tension she'd been carrying since the morning encounter release. Okay, she said quietly. I believe you. That weekend, Dennis took Marie to Sunday dinner at his mother's estate in Westchester, a sprawling property that spoke to old money and carefully maintained power. Catherine Waldron was elegant in the effortless way that came from decades of commanding rooms, observant in a manner that made Marie understand exactly where Dennis had learned to read people, and formidable in a way that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with presence. Dinner was surprisingly comfortable, Catherine asking real questions about Marie's business and listening to the answers with genuine interest. After dinner, while Marie wandered the garden at Catherine's suggestion, Dennis helped his mother clear dishes in the kitchen. Catherine set down her wine glass and looked at her son with the directness that had raised him. She's real, Catherine said quietly. Not performing, not angling for position or trying to manage your reputation. She looked at Dennis with an expression that held approval and warning combined. She can handle your world because she's already handling her own. Don't let her go. Dennis glanced toward the garden where Marie stood looking at the skyline, her posture relaxed in a way he rarely saw. I won't, he said simply. Catherine smiled, the expression holding something that looked almost like relief. Good. Because that woman is the first person you've brought here who looks at you like you're just Dennis, not Dennis Waldron. Dennis brought Marie to a private dinner at a restaurant that didn't take reservations because it only served people who didn't need them. The dining room was closed to the public, just their table and the kind of privacy that came from ownership rather than request. 3 men were already seated when they arrived. Dennis made introductions with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested these weren't just business associates, but the closest thing he had to family. Vincent, his head of security, built like someone who'd spent years learning to end threats efficiently, with observant eyes that tracked Marie's every movement. Marcus, his financial strategist, sharp-suited and sharper-minded, the kind of man who could make money appear and disappear with equal ease. Anthony, his enforcement lead, quiet intensity wrapped in expensive clothes, with the sort of controlled stillness that made Marie think of coiled springs. They were polite. They asked appropriate questions about her consulting business. They made conversation that would have seemed perfectly normal at any corporate dinner. But Marie felt the assessment happening beneath every word. The careful evaluation of whether she belonged in this room, with these men who operated in shadows, Dennis had only begun to explain. Midway through dinner, Anthony set down his glass and looked at Marie with directness that bypassed small talk entirely. "What do you know about our operations?" Dennis's hand found Marie's under the table, a silent offer of support, but she didn't need it. She'd known this moment was coming since Dennis had mentioned the dinner 3 days ago. "I know you operate outside the law," Marie said evenly, meeting Anthony's gaze without flinching. "I know you have territory and rules, and you enforce them. I know Dennis is the reason your world has order instead of chaos." She paused, then continued with the same honesty that had defined everything between her and Dennis. "And I chose to stay, knowing all of that." The silence that followed felt weighted. The 3 men exchanging glances that communicated volumes Marie couldn't quite read. Vincent leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at his mouth. "You're either very brave or very smart." "Maybe both," Marie responded, her voice steady. "Maybe neither. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Something shifted in the atmosphere. Anthony nodded once, the gesture small but significant. Marcus's expression moved from assessment to something that looked almost like approval. Dennis's hand tightened on hers under the table, and when she glanced at him, she saw pride mixed with something deeper in his expression. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to Marie with deliberate precision. "Waldron Properties needs corporate messaging strategy for our real estate portfolio. Legitimate work, full consulting rates, 6-month contract to start." He met her eyes with the kind of directness that suggested this was about more than business. "If you're interested." Marie understood immediately what was actually being offered. This wasn't just a consulting contract. This was acceptance. This was the inner circle signaling she'd passed whatever test they'd been administering and could be trusted with both the public face and the private reality of their world. She picked up the card, her decision already made. "Send me the scope of work," she said. "I'll have a proposal to you by Friday." Marcus smiled, the expression genuine. "Welcome to the family, Marie." Vincent raised his glass, to brave and smart. The men drank, and Marie realized she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She was no longer just dating Dennis Waldron. She was part of his world now, accepted by the men who protected it and enforced its rules. Dennis's hand was still holding hers under the table, steady and certain, and Marie felt safer than she probably should. 3 months after the accidental email that had started everything, Marie stood on Dennis's penthouse terrace overlooking Manhattan. The city sprawled below them in a constellation of lights. The same skyline she'd stared at alone in her apartment for 3 years, now shared with someone who'd made isolation feel like a memory from another life. Dennis stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, and Marie felt the kind of contentment she hadn't known existed outside of romance novels and wishful thinking. I love you, Dennis said quietly against her hair, the words simple and devastating. I need you to know that. Marie turned in his arms, her heart doing something complicated and wonderful in her chest. She looked at this man who'd responded to her vulnerability with protection, who'd trusted her with dangerous truths, who'd rearranged an empire to make time for her. I love you too, she said, the admission easy because it was true. I have for weeks. Dennis's expression shifted into something that looked like relief and certainty combined. He pulled her closer, his hand coming up to cup her face with the gentleness that never failed to undo her. Your lease ends next month. His thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating softness. Don't renew it. Move in here. Be with me, fully, completely. Marie's breath caught. 3 months ago, she'd been drowning alone in her apartment, exhausted from performing competence and maintaining careful distance from everyone in her carefully controlled life. She'd sent an email to the wrong person, one letter difference in a first name, one moment of exhausted carelessness. And that mistake had led to this. To Dennis Waldron holding her on his terrace, asking her to build a life with him in the most unexpected, dangerous, perfect way. She thought about her empty apartment with its takeout containers and lonely skyline view, thought about 3 years of success that had felt like slow disappearance, thought about the accidental email that had mortified her and turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her. Yes, she said, the word coming out certain and clear. Absolutely, yes. Dennis kissed her then. The kind of kiss that confirmed what they both already knew. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't careful. This was the rest of their lives starting right now. When they pulled apart, he kept her close, both of them looking out at the city that had witnessed Marie's isolation and was now witnessing her choosing something entirely different. You're never going to be alone again, Dennis said quietly, the promise absolute. I saw your email and decided immediately you shouldn't be. That hasn't changed. That will never change. Marie leaned back against his chest, his arms solid around her, and felt home in a way that had nothing to do with location and everything to do with the man holding her. She'd sent an email to the wrong Dennis. One accidental click. One moment of vulnerability landing in the inbox of someone dangerous and powerful and completely unexpected. And he'd responded with 5 words that had changed everything. I'm coming. You shouldn't be alone. 3 months later, standing on his terrace with the city spread below them and his promise wrapped around her like protection, Marie understood that sometimes the best things in life happened because of mistakes. Because she'd clicked the wrong name. Because Dennis Waldron had seen an opportunity and refused to miss it. Because 2 people brought together by accident had chosen each other with absolute intention. Marie smiled, her hand covering Dennis's where it rested against her waist, and let herself believe in the impossible thing they'd built from 1 wrong email and 1,000 right choices after. She was home. Finally, completely, perfectly home. And she was never going to be alone again. Thank you for experiencing Marie and Dennis's story, from one accidental email to a love that changed everything. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe. Your support means more stories about unexpected connections, dangerous honesty, and love that defies the odds. Subscribe to never miss a story that reminds you the best things in life sometimes start with beautiful mistakes.